Koutou, ko Clearaspanol Toku Ingoa, and it's a great privilege to be here again gathering with people. And it's been many, many, many years since we've met, and it's been many, many, many years since some of us have been talking about this kaupapa. So yeah, it's a great day, although it's very bright up here and I'm a little bit nervous. So here we go. So I'm going to talk about the initial implementation of Housing First in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then Neville's going to take over in the second half of the presentation and talk more about the outcomes. So I looked for my PhD at the initial implementation at Housing First, and that covered the national sort of program in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also a comparison of 4 smaller studies within that context. I looked at a review of the international Housing First implementation literature, but also key informant interviews with government and community agencies, and some of you are probably in the room today, and also a document analysis, and that looked at the policy, the actual program, but the service design delivery, some of the practices, and also some of the media website information. So, even though I looked at the program overall at the national level, at the local level, I looked at these 3 areas. So at the top, Kirikiriroa, or Hamilton, in central Auckland, Tamariki Makora, and also Wellington, Whanganui Atara. So I asked, how has Housing First been implemented within Aotearoa, New Zealand? Who and what has influenced the implementation process? And also, what were the challenges and success factors during this implementation? And really, how did these relate to changes in policy and also the service delivery context? So I have to say, this was a dynamic context, and Housing First was not funded by government pre-2017, but by 2019, the program had a budget of $197 million. Homelessness or severe housing deprivation was an increasing and accelerating trend, and we have research now that stretches back over a number of years to show that. And of course, equity or inequity and homelessness disproportionately impacts Māori. And we've had a rapid introduction and upscale of policy and service delivery, and that includes transitional housing, emergency housing, the Emergency Housing Special Needs Grant, sustaining tenancies and Housing First, and there's been others subsequently. And I know some of you in this room will be delivering and working very hard to make all of this work. So the macro policy and program context is pretty complicated. And of course, we've got the international, so the rights, but also the rights of Indigenous people. But then at the national level, we've got Te Treaty, and we've also, the establishment in 2015 of the Iwi Chairs Forum. So these things were beginning to develop and and of course, time across that complex set of policy changes that I intimated, and we are where we are today. So my findings showed that within that pre-existing context, there were challenges, and it showed the type and nature of the unmet needs and the social exclusion that was being experienced by people who are homeless, and the negative context, thank you, and the negative consequences of homelessness. There was an inverse care law operating in the 3 cities where those who had the greatest need for care and support were the least likely to get it. And there were multiple drivers of exclusion, and they were evident at multiple levels, so the individual or whānau level, community, systemic and structural. And of course, this is embedded in New Zealand within the history of colonisation, but also contemporary colonialism and ongoing breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So, Housing First in each case was implemented slightly differently, defined slightly differently, but it included Housing First principles, but also Māori cultural principles. And these services were either informed by or based on Māori cultural principles, depending on whether it was a Māori-led response or whether it was a Pākehā-led organisation informed by those principles. Program entry criteria, mainly because of the funding criteria, was experience of homelessness for 12 months in the last 3 years, That was generally without shelter, but also some emergency housing. But there were some rules within the contracts which meant that people couldn't necessarily move between the different programs, and I know you would have experienced that, but also people with a high level of complex need. It was designed mainly by locally providers, but networks, but there was varied inclusion of mana whenua, Māori-led, and people experiencing homelessness. The systemic response was and remains a work in progress. The delivery of housing was often in scattered site housing, but there was some single site, more planned over the time of the study, and actually some of those buildings are now coming to fruition this year and next year. Mainly that was indirectly via the CHIP and private landlord, and with the income-related rent subsidy as a mechanism to help affordability, but then also directly via Housing New Zealand or the accommodation supplement and private landlords shared accommodation, but also CHIP providers shared accommodation and emergency housing. So there was a raft of different housing available, but not enough of it. And the support that was delivered varied in intensity and also approach. So in general, we predominantly went for an intensive case management type configuration of support, and I'd call it multidisciplinary team-like, and that varied in intensity. The caseloads varied between 1 to 10, but also 1 to 20, but without adequate funding and resourcing, that was more like a ratio of 1 to 40. And or key roles and relationships were actually missing that would have potentially strengthened. And the national programme, we defined the Māori cultural principles at the broad rangatiratanga, whakawhanaungatanga, manaakitanga, but then locally, providers embedded what were the significant tikanga based on mana whenua, or then at a different level, mana mahatohaki, for people themselves that they said was important. So overall, Housing First's initial implementation, I'd say, was successful to an extent. And primarily this was based on the strength of partnerships, of teams, networks, the sector working together, but also iwi, Māori-led and health, where that happened. New government funding and resourcing was critical for housing and support, although there's a bit of a caveat. And there was a renegotiation of relationships to an extent, and that was with landlords, but also based on or informed by Housing First and Māori cultural principles, and importantly, the voices of people experiencing homelessness. There were challenges, though, in the planning and the initial implementation, and Māori were excluded from the policy decisions, resulting in political and cultural tensions, and we submitted to the Y 2750 kaupapa inquiry about those. There was also a lack of clarity of terms and also a narrow entry criteria. And when the policy dropped and the music stopped, basically people were stuck in certain places, in certain homes, types of accommodation, and there was not the flexibility in some of the policy decisions and the funding, the resourcing decisions to enable people to move around flexibly to where they identified that they wanted to live necessarily. There were insufficient resources for coordination. Particularly, this took a lot of effort to coordinate, and the providers often filled in that with other types of resourcing and funding. And the housing and support, we need more housing, and we also need more support. There was limited system capacity due to the novelty of the program, but also the emerging system, if you like. So despite Housing First as a program's initial implementation, there was a lack of systemic recognition of the drivers of homelessness. There was fragmentation or a lack of clarity and buy-in across government, but also social policy and service delivery. And silos remained, and I think COVID-19 sort of highlighted 18 months later the challenges that were still there, although I don't take away from the effort and the dedication of everyone trying to work in this space to make this happen. So implementing Housing First and Māori cultural principles was constrained by this context. But these principles, adapted together, can be used to create mechanisms to address these issues effectively if fully implemented. And I think we're beginning to see some ways that may be achieved in the future. And I'm quite encouraged today by what I'm hearing by some people who do have some money and possibly some influence in our leaders. To me, we are beginning to speak similar language, and for me that's encouraging. So the initial framing and implementation of Housing First focused on individuals and whānau and service providers and their capability in navigating a fragmented policy and service delivery landscape. This is an incredibly impossible, superhuman and time-intensive task. Pre-existing policy at worst was exclusion by design for eviction or deportation, and at best a lack of design because it was just too hard. There were clear breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and also the programme's implementation drew attention away from the systemic and structural context surrounding this frame. And whose lens were we really looking through about whether Housing First was going to work? And, I'd argue really it's the inclusion of people with experience of homelessness in that is critical. So the recommendations to increase the effectiveness of response to homelessness, so acknowledgement of the governance and institutional arrangements that do not realise the rights of Indigenous people, the right to housing, and also Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Focus our energies on system alignment and integration, and I'm really glad to hear those words spoken by others, towards Housing First and Māori cultural principles, but that's legislation, policy, service delivery and practices across sectors, not just us understanding silos in a much more granular detail. They're still silos. Somehow we have to bring these together at whatever level makes sense to a particular location. And I've seen these green shoots are beginning to emerge, and there's been a lot of mahi done. Promoting cultural safety, and I look at Irihapiti Ramsden's work around critical self-reflection, and also the voices of people experiencing homelessness and their voices in determining what is culturally safe for them. And of course, we've always got opportunity to cease policy and practice that excludes and generates homelessness and severe housing deprivation. So the future. Strengthening intersecting partnerships. And I know this is a mouthful and it's probably a new made-up term or whatever, but for me it captures what we need to do. It's partnerships, but it's partnerships, many, 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 many ways that we can connect. And of course, advancement by Māori as Māori based on evidence. And I'm really, really pleased to see the research funding and the funding now going towards organisations actually to begin to build that knowledge, to begin to claim that space and to get on and get the job done. Providing housing and support at the scale and intensity required based on people and whānau's preferences. Either or dichotomies are not helpful. It's not housing first, it's not whānau first, it's not anything else first, it's actually all together. We really need to do this. And the diagram really, to me, is what a system would look like. Good governance, the housing we need, the support we need, but also that may come in very, very different forms, and also based in community, and support, and that is based in the local community, but also whenua and the connection for Māori to Tūranga Waiwai. And then I think we'll begin buying, if we increase the sector's capacity, to see a reduction in homelessness. So, almost last slide now. I realise this is a lot of content. So, addressing homelessness is not a mystery, and there's increasing evidence of what is and what is not effective. Leadership, of course, is important, but systemic recognition of those rights we discussed, and I see that as a compass, if you like, systemic alignment and integration moving towards, where we want to go. And of course, a renegotiation of relationships, and that is informed by people experiencing homelessness or with experience of homelessness and people experiencing homelessness, and I think both are important. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much, Carol, who's up in the top row and is the manager of the co-manager of the People's Project. But I can't track her down here because she's way up the top. But thanks for the opportunity to talk to chat. So we've been working for 5 years now, 6 years now with the People's Project in Hamilton, and I kind of wanted to talk mostly about what we've learned from 5 years in from Housing First. Just to reiterate, Housing First is the idea of Housing First everywhere is to move straight from homelessness as quickly as possible to permanent housing with support. These are the key things. The principles of Housing First are about housing as a human right. It's an open-ended commitment, generally from scattered site housing and separation of housing and services. But it's also meant to be self-determined with an element with choice for the people who are there, recovery and orientation, and a strong element of harm reduction. These are the ones that internationally, these are the principles that are seen to work best. And I'm talking about in general, their implementation in the People's Project in Hamilton, who were really the first to start doing this at a large scale, using the international principles in Hamilton. We had 5 streams of research. The IDI one that I'm going to come back to as a statistician, the data stream is quite dear to my heart. But we do need to look at some of the other things, and in particular, some of the groups and some of the LGBTIQ and Takatapui groups. Claire's talked about the transferability and implementation because it wasn't implemented the same everywhere. Even the contracts weren't the same everywhere, so they couldn't have been. And then we need to talk about Te Treaty and where Te Treaty sits in a Housing First context. Because initially, like Jade said here earlier, it is an international program and it is working in the US and particularly in places like Finland, which have adopted it quite deeply, that principle that everybody's housed and everybody's permanently, sustainably housed with the support that they need. We really have a lot of Maori principles too, but that support and that community, and in particular, the Housing First is the tension is the Housing First is an individual program versus the Maori vision, which is quite collectively based. But other than that, and they can be woven together, and quite a few, this is one by Kiri Lawson Teaho and myself did, amongst others, to look at that weaving of those principles together. Actually, that harm reduction, supporting the person, maps nicely onto supporting the family and doing the whānau and doing what's best for the whānau. We do have, if we're going to implement choice, though, in a New Zealand context, we have to have the choice for Papa Kāinga housing. And that means getting substantially more of it in order for it to be a realistic choice. I also wanted to talk about some of the key influences, and this is work by Brodie Fraser, did in their PhD, looking at LGBTIQ population in particular, and a review of the literature and how poverty and that exclusion from services plays out, and exclusion from family can play out into exclusion from services, and how that becomes quite difficult in an LGBTIQ with LGBTIQ identity, and it needs to be acknowledged, and we need to be thinking about how, when we're providing services, not that it works for an average person, but it works for the person who's in front of us, and whatever their needs are, because they want to be themselves, and it's important they can be themselves. So this is the bit I want to talk a little bit about. We took the first 400 people that were housed by the People's Project, and Carol collected for me the NHI, that's the National Health Identifier for everybody. We got consent. We talked early to Statistics New Zealand and talked often to them. And we asked them, can we link this cohort, this first 400 people, to your integrated data infrastructure? And the integrated data infrastructure is mostly the government data sets, all of them. So every time you're filling out a government form, be it when you go to the doctor or to the hospital, when you're picking up a prescription, when you're filling out your taxes, when you get a speeding ticket or when you get pulled over by the police and asks your name. That's all put together and linked once by Statistics New Zealand and then de-identified just using their number and SNZ UID. So we linked with consent and we talked to people. In fact, when we talked to people, they were quite excited about saying, I've filled out so many damn forms in my life. If somebody could have a look at them all together, there would be a mountain. In fact, that's quite true. Looking at it. And then it's the model that we've used with the People's Project is currently being used by the Social Wellbeing Agency as a model. I saw it pop up in some of the Impact Lab stuff as well. It really is looking at that broad picture and that ability New Zealand has really good data and really good innovation, but we do need the time to link it and to have a look to see what differences we're making. I've also used it in my own research. But it's reasonably easy. So the first 390 people, I do want to talk about New Zealand. I do want to mention they're 54% female. And New Zealand is pretty unique in the world, as in this is typical of our homeless population. It's about 50-50 through most of the degrees of homelessness. Everywhere else in the world is quite a skew towards male homelessness at the more severe end. But New Zealand, with our very poor single parent benefit, has a very high rate of female homelessness. Most of the people are working age. Over half were between 25 and 44. And there is, as always in our homelessness statistics, a huge overrepresentation of Maori, with 73% of the cohort being Maori, compared to 41% Pākehā and 7% Pacific Asian and 3% Asian. So this is reasonably typical of what homelessness in New Zealand looks like from a statistics point of view. And then I want to challenge, and people even here say that this group is hard to reach. Of those 390 people, they had 200,000 interactions in the government data sets. So I don't know how you claim that people who've asked for help 200,000 times are hard to reach, but I do know it's a shocking statistic. When I look at the people that Carol housed who were rough sleeping in Hamilton, 99.2% of them were available on the health data sets, as opposed to 96.2% of the general population. They were easier to find on the health data sets. On the justice data sets, they were way easier to find. On the tax and social development data sets, they're easier to find. They have been interacting with agencies for the entirety of their lives, and at that point, they wound up homeless in Hamilton and needing to be housed. Okay? So we had a system, and we probably still have, that despite people showing up at the regular services, health, justice, and MSD, their housing needs are not being addressed. And they are much easier to find and much more common than government data sets than any random person you pick off the street. So this is not a hard to reach group. This is what it looks like for a 15-year history of a homeless population. They're in the light grey at the top. This is their approaches to MSD and time on the main benefit assistance. 15 years beforehand, they were asking for help at a much higher rate than the rest of the population. Homelessness did not come out of nowhere, and it was not hidden. It is, unfortunately, for a lot of our population, predictable, needs asked for well in advance and not addressed. We need to be doing better. 5 years before the baseline, so 5 years before these people, before people were rough sleeping in Hamilton, their hospitalization rate was over 3 times that. Was over 3 times the general population. Their mental health needs were over 20 times the general population. They were 30 times more. They were 10 times more likely to be on the police database, and over 10 times more likely to be facing criminal charges. They were much less likely to be earning. They were slightly less likely to be earning wages and salaries, and much more likely to be on the benefit. We had 5 years warning that these people needed help, and that they needed better support. Thankfully, they got it, and they got it from the People's Project. 5 years after the people were housed by the People's Project, their hospitalisation rate was 44.4% less. That is all-cause hospitalisation was reduced. Their injury rate was 11% less, and the amount of pharmaceuticals was a small reduction. There was a small, so they're seeing the doctors nearly as often, but they're having to show up in a hospital in the acute wards, and they're having to show up for injuries much, much less because they were housed. The big drop here, a huge drop in context is mental health services, with a 25% reduction in all mental health services after 5 years, and a 60% drop in needing to be in bed night units. The first thing you can see change in the data when people are housed is that their mental health is improving, and that improves within 12 months. The next thing that you see happen is this improvement in police offences and income. 5 years after they were first housed, their rate of police offences is 1/3 less. They're 40% likely to be facing criminal charges. They're actually slightly more likely to be reporting as a victim of crime, which we interpret as still having higher interactions and probably still better trust in police to report. Wages and salaries, and this is one of the first things. People's wages and salaries increased 44%. They spent nearly 50% more time in waged jobs. Their income overall was over 138% higher after being housed. Still incredibly low. The average income for this group is still only 17,000, but it's much higher than it was. They're actually receiving, after 5 years, they're receiving they're receiving the benefits slightly less months, but of course they're on the right benefits now, and they're receiving more money overall. And which really talks to the difficulties of getting people on the right benefit, and the need to make sure that people are housed, that they're getting the right benefits, that they're getting the support to get the benefits that they're entitled to, so as then that they can have the income to improve themselves and to help them move on and towards jobs and employment, which the People's Project are now working hard at. So conclusions. Homelessness is the result of a systems failure. If you have 15 years warning and you were asked 200,000 times and it still failed, something went wrong. It wasn't an accident. If we were asked 200,000 times, they're visible to government and they're clearly asking for help. The high rate of asking for help is there for over 15 years. So this is not when we're talking about youth homelessness in the other session, we know who our adult homelesses are next time. We know when we're talking about those at-risk youth, they are the adults of the future. We need to be intervening earlier, even earlier than child homelessness, but we need to be doing it a lot better. There are too many gaps, and when Claire is talking about exclusion, the people who are hitting mainstream services, the GPs, the hospitals, MSD, these need to be working better. They need to be asking more about housing, and they need to be serious about working with the sector to make the housing available so as people are housed. Housing First works. It's a solution for those most in need at the end of the cycle. It's not the first thing you should try, but it does work when we try it, and it works to deliver better outcomes than doing nothing in a mostly Maori community. Housing First enabled better functioning of just about everything. None of the system works for people who are unhoused, and we know this. Interestingly, it's quite clear in the data that there's a fast improvement in mental health, and we're talking about a big mental health recovery. And our mental health support services, I'm going to say, don't work anyway, but they certainly don't work for people who are wondering where they have to sleep at night. And there's a real challenge to get these working better with the communities that ye are serving. So impacts, and I do want to say that this has taken a lot of time, particularly by Carol, but a lot of effort, but it is being used, and it is one of the things that I want to see us do more. I want to work with Rami and the Auckland Collective, and I want to work with here in Otatahi to get this and to have a look at that difference that we're making, because this is this is the exemplar that's used in the wellbeing budget at the moment, is the Housing First in Hamilton. And that, because housing is an enabler of a broad range of changes. And if we can get what other speakers were talking about, that broad change of well-being, and we can quantify it, we can change the logic of why you spend capital to build more houses in the sector, and to build it for the groups that need it. We need to upskill government to understand, to get out of their silos and to understand cross-sectoral things. We need to be using their data to say that this matters to you and to your silo, but also it has to matter across things. It's cited quite a bit. This work is cited quite a bit in the government, the homelessness action plan, and hopefully that will be updated soon. And we were honoured to present the work to the Waitangi Tribunal, the Y2570 claim, which we've heard about earlier, and I'm very hopeful that'll make a difference. The UN Special Rapporteur was really amazed and delighted with the quality of our data and our ability to do, if we can get the data and make it really clear, if we're careful about things, we can really be world leading in showing the difference we're making in New Zealand. And the Europeans love us for the nice homelessness comparisons. Thanks very much. It's really good to talk, and we'll deal with any questions. Disclaimers and stats. The papers are available, and thanks very much, particularly to the People's Project and our other collaborators.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire and Neville. Thank you for speaking to us. It was really, really insightful, I think, to sort of understand some of the complexities around housing and also how data can help us unpack those complexities. I believe we have time for a few questions. If anybody in the audience has any questions, David might zip around with the mic, and we can put them to Claire and Neville. Going once.
You're okay.
You really are blind when you're on stage.
Neville, thank you so much for your research. I just love it. It's so deep and so rich and so informative for us as a sector. I've got a question around mental health outcomes between the varying Housing First programs. Yep. It seems to me that we've picked up a model that was meant to be a psychiatric model, and yet in New Zealand we've implemented it more as a housing model and potentially a kaupapa Māori model, which is brilliant. I'm just wondering if any of the research you're doing is showing different outcomes around mental health between Christchurch, Auckland, Hamilton.
Yeah, so I've only done the Hamilton one yet, mostly waiting for that. The biggest difficulty is, of course, waiting 5 years for the 5-year outcomes to happen. But I am really keen, because there was, and as Claire's work on implementation showed, there were some real differences, some real interesting differences and some strengths that each of the areas brought to it. So I'm really keen to, and the WISE group has a big history in mental health, and they let out the TPP. So I'm really keen to see, is that replicated in the other areas? I think it's an open question. Yeah.
Yeah, Kate, I'll just add to that as well, that even though it was started as a mental health, in that strain, actually multidisciplinary team working is kind of the core of it. So really you have every group and every person, support worker represented, and it's quite an intensive team-based support. It can be. So it can be any shape or form, depending on the group that you want to. So that could be young people, families. So it can look different.
Sherry from Homes for People, Palmerston North. I'm jealous. We asked HUD about this a few years ago, and the person who, I think they were our relationships manager at the time, said just muttered something about it being a pilot. So I'm sure that's not a question you can answer.
Yeah, but it is something we can do. It does require scale, and we waited till we had 400 done, because that's the kind of scale to show statistical power. But it is, HUD should be doing this for everybody. It's not particularly hard to do. So keep hassling him and say, hey, Hamilton did it. Palmerston, why not Palmerston North too? Yeah.
Hi, Annette from ComCare in Christchurch. I was really interested in what you were saying around the how long it was predictable for. And I guess we have interventions that are an earlier stage from long-term street homelessness. So ComCare assists people out of psychiatric care, assists people who are in housing distress, who are mentally ill. We've collected NHIs for years, so we've got data on about 800.
Yep.
My question is, and I suppose it comes down to the money, what kind of resource would we need to really look at outcomes for that group so that we could, because it's an unusually health-funded housing project, and I'd say that it's something that could be really useful everywhere, but under the new Te Whatu Ora, we've lost our DHB who supported it, and we need to kind of explain it to the larger health organisation, but also hopefully make it happen.
Yeah, so for Te Whatu Ora, they've already done it. We did it with them. So we've done it for the Healthy Homes Initiative. With Te Whatu Ora, there was 30,000 children who had been hospitalised for housing-related diseases, and they had a nurse or a community worker visit their home to give them some advice. And they've put that on the IDI and found that improving kids, if the home is improved, are less likely to come back to hospital, and their education was better, and their health education and the family income was better. So there is the capability, and there's no reason. So Te Whatu Ora should be evaluating these innovative things that are being done. It just takes time. It's slow, but particularly if you've it done, you have the NHIs. This is not difficult to do in the New Zealand system. It's time consuming though.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Cool. I think we're happy to wrap up the session there. But once again, thank you so much, Claire and Neville. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Theo. Thanks, everybody. Always a pleasure.